History isn't always about glorious battles and brilliant inventions. Sometimes it's just deeply, deeply weird. Today, we are digging up some of the most unsettling and bizarre moments from our past. So maybe leave the lights on for this one.
Okay, let's start with a wild question. What if the one family photo you had included a relative who was no longer alive? It sounds like something straight out of a horror movie, right? Well, for a while, this was actually a pretty common way to remember someone you'd lost. And that brings us to our first section, when death gets weird. We're going to look at some truly bizarre rituals, and it all kind of kicks off with the invention of photography. So here's the deal. Before cameras, if you wanted to remember what a loved one looked like, you had to commission a painted portrait. And that was super expensive, something only the rich could afford. But then, in the late 1800s, photography changed everything. All of a sudden, you had post-mortem photography, which was way cheaper. Sometimes the deceased would be posed in a peaceful last sleep, but other times, and this is where it gets really jarring, they'd be propped up with their living relatives for one final, haunting family photo. Yeah, a family photo with a corpse is definitely strange. But believe it or not, that's nothing compared to the story of a pope who literally faced a judge and jury after he was already dead. To really get what happened here, we've got to go all the way back to the 9th century in Italy. Things were chaotic, to say the least. The Vatican was basically a revolving door of power. I mean, just look at this timeline. In a single 100-year period, there were about 20 dozen popes. It was an incredibly messy and dangerous time to be in charge of the church. And that brings us to this guy, Formosus. He started as a bishop, but got excommunicated by Pope John VIII. But after Pope John died, Formosus actually made a comeback and got himself elected pope in 891. His time at the top, though, was full of political drama and only lasted 5 years before he died. So after another pope came and went in just 15 days, seriously, 15 days, Pope Stephen VI took over. And this new pope had a massive grudge against Formosus, who was already long gone. He was convinced Formosus had illegally taken the papacy, so he did the only thing that made sense to him. He had Formosus's corpse dug up, dressed in the full papal robes, and put on trial.
This trial, which is now known as the Cadaver Synod, was a total sham. I mean, can you just picture it? The corpse of Pope Formosus is propped up in a chair, acting as the defendant. A poor deacon had to hide behind the throne and speak for him, and at one point, when the deacon was making a point for the defense, Pope Stephen apparently yelled this one word, objection. He objected to a statement being made on behalf of a corpse.
Shocker! The corpse was found guilty, and the punishment was brutal. They ripped off the 3 fingers Formosus had used for blessings, and then just chucked his body into the Tiber River. But here's the final twist. The public was so disgusted by this whole spectacle that they rioted, had Pope Stephen arrested, and he was later strangled to death in prison. All right, next up, we're exploring a body's bizarre afterlife. This is where the deceased stop being part of a ritual and start becoming, well, a commodity. And when I say things get strange, I mean really strange. Ancient Chinese texts talk about something called the mellified man. And yeah, it's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. A type of medicine made from a human body that's been soaked in honey. The whole process was intense. First, an elderly volunteer would agree to eat nothing but honey. They'd do this until their entire body was saturated with it, right up until they passed away. Then their body would be sealed in a stone coffin, completely filled with more honey, and just left to ferment for 100 years. The stuff that came out at the end was apparently broken into pieces and sold as a super expensive cure for things like broken bones. Okay, so we've gone from the body as medicine to something even darker. Now we're going to talk about a time when a body became a source of horrifying entertainment. 6 handkerchiefs. What could that possibly mean? Well, this was the price someone paid to witness something truly unthinkable. So in 1888, James Jameson, yes, the heir to the famous Jameson whiskey fortune, was on an expedition in Central Africa. He became morbidly obsessed with local stories about cannibalism. According to his own translator, Jameson gave a slave trader 6 cloth handkerchiefs to buy a 10-year-old girl for the specific purpose of watching her be killed and eaten by a local tribe. Jameson didn't just stand by and watch. He actually sat down, took out his notebook, and sketched the entire horrific event as it happened.
Now, he later denied the whole story after his translator told everyone, but those sketches, they served as some pretty chilling evidence against him.
For our last section, the horror gets a lot closer to home. We're talking about The Vampire Next Door, the story of a man who, to everyone around him, seemed completely and totally normal. In the early 1900s, a man named Bela Kiss had these large metal drums all over his property. He just told his neighbors he was stocking up on fuel for the coming war. You know, a perfectly normal explanation. But then Kiss went off to fight in World War I, and his landlord decided to open one of the drums. Inside, he didn't find fuel. He found a dead body. The police came and searched the entire property. They found 24 bodies in total, including his own wife and her lover, all preserved inside these metal drums. But the really chilling part, all of the victims had been drained of their blood, and they had puncture marks on their necks. His known interest in the occult, combined with how he left his victims, quickly earned him a nickname, the Vampire of Sincota.
So, of course, a massive manhunt started. The police actually tracked him to a hospital in Serbia where he was recovering from war injuries. But by the time they got there, he'd already swapped his identity with a dead soldier and just disappeared. Bela Kiss was supposedly spotted a few times over the years, but he was never, ever captured. He just vanished into thin air. From post-mortem photos to real-life vampires, these stories feel like they're from another world, a distant and brutal past. But it does make you wonder, doesn't it? What things that we do today, things that we think are completely normal, will people in the future look back on and be absolutely horrified by?